been a great pleasure to give these three talks, and what it's also done for me, I think, is to allow me to reflect and think upon a range of topics that have both interested me, frustrated me, and hopefully that eventually that we will make progress in addressing and resolving some of them. And the thinking behind this third lecture is to argue for trying to embed transport thinking more in the social sciences. It's primarily in the past been dominated, I suppose, by people who've had training in engineering, economics, and the social sciences have an important part that I will try and set out. And secondly, I would like to try and introduce you to some of my thinking on solutions. What are the ways forward? And I'm an optimist by nature, and I do feel that we've got to a situation that there are distinct ways in which we can begin to think much more imaginatively about how we can make our transport systems more sustainable. So, firstly, let's see how this brilliant. That's right. I have two slides which sort of set the sort of scene on this. One is trying to give you this global perspective. Most of the debate is over carbon dioxide, and transport's now at about 7 gigatons of carbon dioxide produced from the transport sector globally. And the debate is now well advanced. I don't know if any of you have seen the new IPCC reports, which are now in draft, which will be published later this year. This is Assessment Report AR5. I'll make a mention to this a little bit later on as well. But from their perspective, most of the science now, they seem to have relatively strong agreement on, and they feel fairly confident with what they're saying, which is in marked contrast to the previous reports. This graphic shows data from 1970 up to 2050. To the left here is real data, historic data from the IEA, the National Energy Agency. And this is one set of, I suppose, reasonably well-respected futures, which is from the World Business Conference on Sustainable Development, and suggesting that by 2050 we could be in a situation where the emissions of CO2 from the transport sector could double, so from the 7 to about 14 gigatons. But we have to remember as well that transport brings enormous benefits to society. The way in which systems are organised, the way in which trade is organised, people's holidays, leisure travel, etc., the globalisation of the economy means that we can't get away from travel. But there is also the argument that transport is totally dependent on oil. If, as I say to my students, if someone comes to me with a business plan for transport and says that you're 98 or 97% dependent on one source of raw material, I will tell them to go away and think about a better business plan. It is very, very constraining to have all of your energy coming from one source, particularly if the origins of that source tends to be from the more difficult parts of the world. The prices may be quite volatile, and this may again lead to instability. So we have a situation that is totally oil dependent. It uses about 60% of global oil, more so in the EU. And as I suggested, it's a major contributor to CO2 emissions, about 25%. If we look at it within Europe, Europe likes to see itself to be at the leading edge of the debate, and this has been reinforced in the 2011 white paper on transport. But if we look at the figures, we find that very little progress has been made. So here we have the data from 1990 until roughly now. This is the amount of CO2 emitted within the transport sector, so 951 megatons up to 1224, which is an increase of nearly 30%. So within transport, it has increased over that period of time. And this set of figures shows what its proportion is across the economy as a whole. So in 2000, transport was contributing 16.5%. It's now 25%, and this has increased of an order of magnitude as well. I think what this shows is how difficult it is to actually achieve any sort of stabilisation, let alone reduction of carbon emissions within transport. And it should also be remembered that these figures exclude aviation, international aviation and maritime. So if we included those within them, these figures would be even higher. So we have a situation where we have growth in traffic, until very recently at least. We have growth in traffic, and although there is greater efficiency, we're still both in a relative sense and in an absolute sense producing or contributing more to CO2 emissions. If we look then at what has happened and trying to think through, I think what we come up with is some quite clear directions that have been followed in the past. And this is based on work that I've done with Tim Schwann and Gillian Annabelle in the recent past. What we seem to have moved ourselves into a situation is that there is an acceptance that this is a really difficult problem. The complexity, I think, is there. And the main aim, and this may have been a mistake, has been on decarbonisation. This has been the primary objective, it seems, within transport and environmental policy, reducing the carbon emissions. Very important, but there are other aspects as well. And the way this has been conceptualised, the way this has been looked at is, firstly, and probably most importantly, what can we do on the technology? So looking at different types of technology, hybrids, electric vehicles, looking at weight of vehicles, looking at fuels efficiency. Secondly, we've looked quite heavily at the price of carbon. So fuel prices, the taxation on fuels has been an important element. There's also been moved towards the possibility of cap and trade approaches like with the European trading system, and looking at ways in which we could look at pricing the negative externalities. So pricing some of these pollutants, pricing other costs that are associated with transport. Thirdly, it's often been seen that infrastructure investment is one way to resolve the issues of the problems that the environmental problems that transport creates. If we have a system that is operating more efficiently, we will use less energy and things will be working better. I find this one quite a difficult one to actually follow through. So there's infrastructure investment, but also looking at, does high-speed rail, does that really reduce the carbon, or does that just encourage longer journeys and things? But low-carbon transport, looking at investment in buses, in walking and cycling networks, looking at the possibility of increasing urban densities, looking at transit-oriented developments, TODs, trying to concentrate things together. So there is some thinking there. Then fourthly, a fourth strand of the sort of current thinking is looking at behavioural change, looking at ways in which we can begin to understand how people make decisions, how people make their choices. So we've got attitudes, lifestyle, the sort of patterns, the values within society that are based both, placed both on the environment and on carbon. And finally, we have institutional, organisational structures, governance factors. The importance here of standards, rules, regulations, and the very complicated and quite difficult role of the different agencies and trying to resolve the way in which they can work together. So these are sort of 5 elements that seem to our thinking to be central to the way in which both social sciences but also other approaches have adopted to looking at issues relating to sustainable mobility and transport. It's very much based in the established scientific debates about transport as being part of a normal science. And I think one of the real difficulties here is that it may encourage what are called path-dependent futures. that we've done this in the past, we're going to do the same sort of thing in the future, maybe in a slightly different way. And this might lead to what is also sometimes known in the literature as lock-in to various types of approaches to the resolution of different problems. And I'll just illustrate this with the sort of the approaches that have been adopted. Primarily quantitative studies, use of models, use of statistical methods, regression, etc., choice modelling, are often trend-based. So this is the graphic in the down looking at consumption per capita against vehicle ownership, and looking at relationships here and looking at ways in which those relationships might evolve over time, either across space or within one particular location. Increasingly, those scenario-based approaches seem to be quite popular, sometimes divided into three different categories. The first group are projective or forecasting type approaches that tend to, again, look at what's happened in the past and project that forward into the future. Then there are the sort of prospective ones, which are looking at different types of futures, often over a much longer term time horizon. Quite popular both in Europe, but particularly in France. And then thirdly, there are the backcasting approaches that are looking at more normative futures. So what are the desirable futures? What sort of futures would we actually like? And these can be quite trend-breaking. So that's a sort of business as usual, and we say, right, well, if we're looking at sustainable futures, we need to follow a pathway that is like this. So how can we get from where we want to be, from where we are, rather, to where we want to be? So that's the backcasting approach that could be adopted. But the methods are primarily quantitative. The methods, again, even in the scenario approaches, have a fair amount of quantification with them, although there is a move towards more participatory approaches within this thinking. So based primarily on positivistic epistemologies with hierarchical perspectives, much of it being expert-led in terms of determining types of knowledge, relevance, reasoning and assumptions, with limited input from outsiders. So this is perhaps the conventional way of actually doing things. So what we tried to do in this piece of work then was to begin to say, right, are there other ways in which we can look at these same sort of problems? And we leaned heavily on the work of an American, John Rouse, and his reinterpretation of the classic works by Thomas Kuhn, who's on this side here in his Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and Martin Heidegger on his Being and Time. And what we were trying to do here is to try and understand a little bit more about how scientific thinking develops and what can be the contribution that the social sciences can actually make to that understanding. And we came up with, or used, three of the dimensions which have been produced within both Kuhn's and Heidegger's work. Firstly, looking at issues relating to prepossession and familiarity. How do we get our background understanding of what's actually going on? We acquire this through education, through training, through talking with people, and this is what is the surrounds within which research takes place. Secondly, there are various ways in which we could actually begin to think about dealing with some of these different problems. So this is sort of talking about preview, what is problematic in the issue. In this case, it could be sustainable mobility or climate change, and how can we actually approach that problem. And thirdly then, saying, right, well, what are the ways in which we can actually try and resolve that type of thinking? So what are the solutions? What are the ways in which the issue can be resolved? So there's a framing of it, there's the articulation of the problem, and the ways in which we could actually begin to deal with those issues. And I think this sort of framework begins to help us understand and interpret the approaches and the research that we can then begin to think a little bit more imaginatively about what can actually be done. And we use this framework to try and then frame the way in which the climate change debate has been formulated in the literature. So these concepts help us to try and understand the development of transport studies and looking at the way in which one can identify different path dependencies. So the sort of 6 conclusions, or the 6 points that we came up with, were firstly the scale of the task. And I think one of the lessons that we've actually learned from doing this work, and I suppose myself more being engaged in this debate over a longer time, is the difficulty of trying to get the message across to actually look at ways of tackling sustainable mobility, or ways in which we can look at the issues relating to carbon. It is a huge task, both in terms of communicating it, but in terms of getting the understanding that the scale of the change that might be needed to help address it. And the fact that single solutions won't get us to where we want to be. We're talking about multiple and complex ways of tackling these problems. Secondly, that most of the thinking is heavily focused on technology. Technology is a solution. And I think, again, the conclusion that we would come to is, yes, technology has a really important role to play, but it is only part of it. That we have to begin to think about doing things in rather different ways. Thirdly, that there was this embedded thinking that which we call sort of logic of provision, that if we invest in something, that people's behaviour will actually change. So if we invest in a better bus service, or we invest in cycle lane, then people will do things differently. Yes, that is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. We need to be much, much more actively engaged. So it's not just providing them with the means, it's actually talking to them, it's relating to them, and trying to get them to see what we're trying to do, and get them to change the way in which they might be thinking about doing things. Fourthly, the market approach is totally, or seems to be totally dominated. And among the literature is this very strong presumption that we can commodify carbon emissions and we can put a price on them. Okay, so pricing is seen as a solution. If we just, as the economists might say, get the prices right, then this will resolve our problem. Again, it is important to get the prices right, but I think, again, it's perhaps naive to think that that will solve the problem. It will be an important element, but it won't necessarily sort everything out. The fifth finding we had was that research emphasising behavioural change is becoming much, much more central to the debate. And this is really good news, because we don't, we tend to look at people behaving in certain fairly well specified ways, when the reality is much, much more complicated than that. So we can understand what makes, or what is most important to individuals, and we can then talk to them and look at ways in which that can be helpful in terms of changing behaviours. Quantitative methodologies, as I said, have been quite powerful throughout all of this, and this notion, this positivistic approach has prevailed, but more participatory and softer approaches, qualitative approaches, are increasingly being used. What also seems to happen, I didn't put this up as the seventh point, is that many of the approaches, the more novel approaches, tend to be peripheral to the conventional wisdom, but over a period of time might get incorporated within the conventional thinking. So they're not excluded, but they're added to. So the toolbox of convention becomes larger, and as new approaches become more mainstream. But the conclusion we came to was one of path dependency. The experiences in the past development of transport studies, that also patterns the responses to new and existing changes, stimuli, rather than radically new different. So yes, things are changing, but it's incremental, it's minor change, rather than something which is fairly or very much more novel in its thinking. So that was part of our review, and it was based on a series of quite extensive interviews, mainly with non-transport people talking about transport, but also with some with transport people. We then sort of began to think about different ways in which social science could actually be more active in making contributions to the analysis of sustainable mobility and the role of looking at ways in which carbon can be reduced. And there were 4 or 5 ones which came up. I just want to mention 2 here, but I'll mention some of the others just in passing. Firstly, there was the thinking that the techno-economic focus, which is currently at the core of transport thinking, should be sort of modified a little bit in moving a little bit away from this overemphasis on neoliberal views on markets and the way in which markets operate, and to some extent towards ecological modernisation, looking at the role in which the economics and the environment can be matched up more effectively. But also that this should be extended to look at ways in which climate change mitigation in transport must be understood as much more as a complex multiplicity of different sources of social sciences. So behavioural economics is one area we looked at, and I think that has a lot that it can actually offer to the debate. We looked at habits, which is an area of work that we're working on at the present, trying to reinforce good habits rather than looking at habits as being negatively valued, looking at ways in which we can encourage certain types of habits to occur. But there are a much wider range of approaches. I mentioned ethnography, CA participation, action research. But socio-technical transition seems to us to be one particular area, which is something that colleagues in the Netherlands and to some extent here in Belgium as well are well versed with. And this is looking at niches, regimes and landscapes. So one's looking at innovation but within an existing regime, which in turn is embedded within a landscape, a governance and policy-oriented landscape. So a transition is seen as being co-evolutionary, which allows many different players, many different actors to look both at what's happened in the past and how that's influenced what's happening now, but also trying to look more prospectively to see how innovations can change the way in which people think in the future. So this is looking at a dynamic, and we've looked at it in terms of how electric vehicles might work their way into the markets. And I think this creates both interest and a huge problem, in the sense that within the existing transport market, the regime there is a well-established regime of conventional transport powered vehicles. What does an electric vehicle offer that is over and above what is already offered within that regime at the moment? And so unless the landscape changes, unless the policy environment, the thinking there changes, it is going to be quite problematic for electric vehicles to make their way into the market. It would be interesting to discuss that with you afterwards. Practice theories, on the other hand, is another group of work that links in some ways to some notions of habit and routinization, but it looks at it in a more sort of deeper way, I suppose, and it looks at 4 main elements. The material elements, which are the objects, the infrastructures, what's actually there. So how does that influence what goes on? So that's talking about the hardware, about the roads, about the vehicles, about people, about freight and things. Then it looks at procedures. How do they actually work? What are the competencies? What are the knowledge bases of the different players within the transport system? And then, and I think quite importantly, there are 2 additional parts which talk about symbolism, about the meaning, the identity, the norms that people normally have. So it's explicitly interested in how people understand things, how people might behave. And then the affectations are talking about softer factors like emotions, like feelings, like moods, atmospheres, other things that might also in a much less sort of a concrete way, less substantive way, actually influence how people behave. So individuals are seen as sort of carriers of different types of practice. So it's trying to build up an understanding based on what people do, what people feel, what people actually think. For most of you, you probably think this is a whole load of very obscure theory, and I understand at least half of you are not into that. So I'll switch into a slightly different mode with a few pictures that will allow you to see how some of these ideas might actually work in practice. But what I'm trying to argue, I think, what I'm trying to get across is that there is a lot of new and I think very interesting and potentially very powerful thinking that's going on within the social sciences that has a major or can have a major contribution to play in terms of thinking of new ideas, new solutions to problems, but also beginning to sort of look at ways in which one can move towards a much more sustainable transport system. So I wanted just to sort of talk briefly about two sets of propositions. So these are two alternatives, but I don't see them as being mutually exclusive alternatives. They're different pathways. I label them path breaking rather than path dependent. And one is based primarily on pushing technology very hard. The other's on what I call rethinking urban mobility, which is a softer way of looking at things. So basically, the first side is to sort of think about cities of the future with these sort of concept vehicles, or I'm always intrigued by this. These are stackable vehicles. So it's quite a nice idea that MIT came up with at one time. So a bit like shopping trolleys. So when you finish with them, just shove them together and take them out. And then on the other side, rethinking urban mobility. This graphic is meant to. One of the elements of that is shrinking the car, which I think is a really nice idea. And if we shrink the car to a third of its size, it creates all sorts of new dynamics in the sense that you need less space, you get more space release, you get big opportunities for actually using that space. And then we get the sort of ideas that we have with the Paris plage and things like that, which is saying that not everybody in Paris can go to the beach, so let's bring the beach to Paris. So we have the beaches in Paris, and the skies are always blue in Paris as well, so it's great. So that's the sort of two sorts of thinking. So we just look at the first one, and the nearest I think we're getting towards that is a place called Masdar, which is in Abu Dhabi. Masdar meaning the source in Arabic. And it's located, Abu Dhabi is here, the international airport there, it's located in between the two. And what they're trying to develop there is a city that has no carbon and no waste to it. It has an area, as it says here, 6 square kilometres, a residential population of about 6,000. The intention is to increase that by 5, 6, 7 times. All powered by solar energy. So whereby previously cities had had walls around them, this is on the same sort of system, that the walls are solar panels. So they use the walls to generate the energy. No cars. There is rail access to Abu Dhabi. It's built at the pedestrian scale, and it uses traditional Arab technologies, which are natural cooling. That means that the air at street level is only a cool 30 degrees rather than a rather hot 40 degrees. I know you can all imagine what 30 and 40 degrees is actually like. On the transport side, they have these transport pods. So the original design was for a personal PRT, personal rapid transit system, pod cars, operate automatically, the driverless system, so you just, when you get into one of these pods, you will just put the coordinates in or put the place in where you want to go. It will then take you there with about 100 different stops or destinations, and about 3,000 vehicles are needed to cater for the sort of amount of travel that's there. These are low speed. The pods operate subterraneanly, so they're air conditioned and things. And they're powered, as we said, from solar electricity. So one sort of possible solution might be to have a city like that. I think the problem here is that it's really difficult to retrofit something like that. That it's fine if you're in a rich country and you're building something in the desert that's got a lot of sand. Even here they've had problems that they were meant to be self-sufficient in their water, but when they sunk the wells down the artesian to get water, it was saline. So they've had to use a desalination plant by the sea and bring the water in. So even here, where they can throw money at it, it's quite a problem to produce that. But there may be some potential for that type of activity. Rethinking. The second one is rethinking urban mobility. Perhaps in cities that are well established, are difficult to redevelop from scratch, and are sort of less flexible in what they can actually do. But what I just wanted to highlight first is the notion that a car is not particularly good at doing what it's meant to be doing. And there's all this debate now about technology, but to my mind, most of the thinking about that technology seems to be to design a vehicle that has a different power unit. It could be a hybrid, it could be an electric vehicle, it could be a fuel cell vehicle. But essentially it's the same vehicle. If you go, we had a presentation this year from BMW, and they're talking about I-versions of all of their vehicles across the whole of the range. They've got a small, whatever it's the 1 series, that will be rolled out, and they've got one on the 7 series as well, I think. And they'll do it across the whole series. But if we look at the sort of the facts, and maybe I put this a little bit crudely here, buying a car is one of the major investments that anybody makes, apart from home in some cases. It's a major cost. Yet, you buy a car, and particularly if it's a new car, its value probably halves within 2 years. Okay, maybe even more than that. Now, that doesn't seem to be a very good deal, that if somebody was going to say to me, buy something, you guarantee that it's going to be worth half as much as it was in 2 years' time. So I put here, is it an asset or a liability? It's multifunctional, which is great. And what we tend to think here, I suppose, is what sorts of uses we make of it, and we get a car that fits those uses best. It's a compromise. In many cases, instead of carrying 4 people or 5 people or 1, you're carrying 1 person. What a waste of space. It's energy inefficient. Again, if someone came to me and says, look, I'm going to design you something that's going to weigh 1,200 kilograms to carry something that weighs 75 kilograms around, I'll tell them to go back and think about it again. They got the wrong business model. That's, and you shouldn't be doing this. Crazy use of, it's crazily inefficient. In fact, the bike is really efficient when we come to that, because a bike you can get weighing, I don't know, 25, maybe even less than that, and it's carrying something that is heavier than itself, which is what it should be doing. There's a huge amount of investment in the support system for the car, in terms of the road infrastructure, the trafficking, the policing, the fuel stations, the repairs, the maintenance, etc. of the vehicle. The car dominates the urban environment in many cities. So in a sense, the city is a city of cars rather than a city of people and things. So it's not there. It's intruding within that, making it difficult to cross roads. It's a noisy environment. It's a polluting environment. And point certainly is substantial environmental and social costs, which you see from that in terms of crashes, accidents, in terms of a whole range of environmental issues. But you could argue that it's symbolic of success, image and status. When I asked BMW how much are they going to charge for one of their electric vehicles, I couldn't get an answer. So I said it's going to be expensive, and he says price doesn't matter, it's the experience that does. So yeah, that's the sort of argument that they're actually. So maybe that still is an important sort of thing. But I think what I'm trying to say here is that okay, the car's done really well for 100 years, but don't we now have an opportunity to begin to rethink that and the role of the car, particularly the car in the city? So the sorts of things that I would see as being sort of key to that new thinking would be, A, as I said, to shrink the car. Less parking, more open space, you're able to use lighter weight materials. So if you have a car that carries, well, maybe 2 people or maybe even 1 person, that would be one way forward. New ownership patterns. So let's move away from the ownership, i.e. you own the vehicle, to something that is saying you have access to that vehicle. So that could be sharing, it could be leasing, it could be all sorts of new forms. So what that would allow you to do is, I think, 2 fundamentally different things to what I've done at the moment. One is that you'll be able to lease share the vehicle that is most suitable to the requirement that you actually have of that vehicle. So if you're going to do a shopping trip or something, you would have one sort of vehicle. If you're going out in the country at the weekends or something, you take another vehicle. If you're moving house, you share another vehicle. Secondly, it puts much more onus on the manufacturers to produce a vehicle that is suitable for the type of use that you actually want, and it uses the best available technology. So if access is restricted in the city centre to non-polluting vehicles, you could specify that. So the deal is that the company provides you with that, and that you don't have the problem that when you buy that vehicle, it's your problem and you've got yesterday's technology. So new ownership patterns, I think, are crucial. And if we're looking around us, as I was just saying when I arrived here in Ghent, but I mean the famous or infamous Boris bikes in London now, which are being extended out. People are quite prepared, it seems, to share bikes and things now. And it's been an enormous success. You know, within 6 months they've had over 500,000 trips. They've now up to about 6 or 7 or something like that. The system's been extended, having cycle highways and things like that. People are prepared to do that, and this is a much more creative use of the smart technologies to be able to share them. So let's roll it out in cars and in other forms of mobility as well. Thirdly is to look at transport as a service rather than transport as a form of movement. So what that is suggesting is that what we should be doing is that if people want to go from one place to another, that they should be able to find out about what combination of different transport modes are most appropriate for that. Much of the transport debate is modally based. You know, if we go back to the sort of transport model, one of the main elements is the notion of choice, which is a tricky notion anyway, and it's your choice choosing between different forms of transport on the basis of some set of decision rules like utility or something, or time minimization or something like that. What this is doing is saying that people who move from one place to other, this is mobility services, require probably more than one form of transport to get them from where they want to be to where they want to go. Can we look at it as an integrated service so that you put into your smartphone, you want to go from one place to another, your phone will come back with the information as to what the alternatives are, and if you decide to accept some one of those alternatives, it will make sure that the bike is waiting for you at the station, the shared bike or the leased bike or the taxi or whatever form it might be. So the whole of that experience is a seamless experience. The whole of that experience will be carried out electronically, the pricing and information could be given to you as well. I don't see it as a big problem. I think we're moving in that direction, but as I said right at the beginning, it's trying to scale that up to something that works at a city-wide level. Maybe here is the place to do it. A city like Ghent, not too big, not too small. It's relatively easy for people to think about its geography and the way in which things work together. Maybe this is a really good place to start. Fourth point here, efficient public transport. This is, again, a prerequisite in cities is that if you have dense flows of people, you need to have efficient public transport to be able to get goods around. And finally, we've got perhaps a potential for small, slow electric vehicles. not as a replacement, as I put here, but as a new form of transport, trying to think of it in a rather a different way to the way in which perhaps motor manufacturers and we might conventionally look at this. Okay, so some ideas there. What are the problems? Why isn't this really happening? And I think there are sort of 2 or 3 key issues here. There's a really interesting notion at the moment called it's been around some time, but in various forms, on looking at notions of collaborative consumption. So this is moving away from individual consumption to much more of a sharing society. There's a book I'm reading at the moment by Rachel Botsman, which is a sort of one of the, I think, key sort of thinking about this. What it's trying to argue is that the lifestyles we're in, and this has been encouraged by and I think the examples people take of the motor industry, the sort of the arguments that are prevalent in Sloan or in Henry Ford's, Alfred Sloan and Henry Ford, the way in which we buy, use, trash type of lifestyle. So there's this sort of, we buy something, we use it, we get rid of it. And what Rachel Bossman says is in America, there's something like 10 or 15% of the things which you buy are never actually used. Okay? You buy them, but you don't never use them. They're there, and you forget that they're there, or you moved on, or something like that. A huge waste. What the argument is that this needs changing. We should be sharing, renting, borrowing, and embedded within that is this notion of the circular economy. So the economy should be circular. So we shouldn't be trashing things. We should be trying to reuse and reduce, reuse this circularity within it. So there's a basic change here, which is an argument moving away from our interest in consumption towards a new type of dynamic. And secondly, on the right-hand side here, up here, it's looking at issues. There's a huge amount of resources and finance, mainly public finance, embedded within the system that we actually have. And what this is trying to do seems to be to promoting higher levels of mobility. And I think a counter-argument to this is that, and I'll come back to this towards the end, is how can we make better use of the existing capacity? So when we talk, or when I talk to decision makers, they're saying, right, we'll invest in high-speed rail, we'll invest in another runway, Heathrow, we're investing in new capacity. There's a huge amount of capacity that we have, which is not used at the moment. If we look at freight, there's a lot of lorries, trucks that are carrying air and not much else going around. There's a lot of cars, I've already said, that are designed for 4 people taking 1 person, not 2, 3 or 4. Even public transport at certain times of the day is not fully occupied. How can we look at ways of making much better use of the capacity that's already there? And that's just not just within the public transport sector. There are many other sectors that provide transport services, schools, education services, health services, social services. They have their own transport systems. Why can't we look at this across the board to allow that capacity to be used in a much better way? And secondly, within cities, space is a key resource that we actually have. Whose space is it? How can we make better use of that space? So by having smaller or less cars and cars that take up less space, we can actually release space. How do we use that? What's the best way in which that can be used as a resource? So I think those are the 2 sort of ways in which we need to rethink the dynamic. But having said that, in many European cities in particular, there are lots of good examples of what's going on. Walking and cycling more than 50% of the trips, and public transport probably a further 20 or 30%. So, we're getting towards some of this sort of thinking, although I think perhaps there's a lot more that can actually be pushed forward. This shows the numbers of trips, the patterns of travel by cycling. Probably can't read it at the front, certainly can't read it at the back. The Netherlands here, which is 27%, Denmark at about 16 or 18% there, and coming down here. There are substantial levels of trips by bike. Cities like Copenhagen are well cited in terms of the numbers of trips that people use, 30% there for the journey, more than 30% for the journey to work, and having a target now of nearer to 50 or 60% in the next, I think, 7 years in Copenhagen in terms of cycling. So there's a lot of potential there, and there's an increasing amount of literature. There are some, if this is secular, there are a couple of, I don't know if they're still active, weblinks there which sort of show what's happening in one or two cities. So what we've done then is to sort of suggest, well, there are different pathways that could be followed, path-breaking ways forward, whether it's technology or whether it's moving towards rethinking notions of urban mobility. But I think here, just to pause, and then I just want to talk finally a bit about global governance and different forms of governance, because I feel this is an important but neglected area of work in this, in the sustainable mobility context. How do I see sort of city transport in the post-carbon society? Well, the green print, and again, I'd be interested in discussing this or elements of this afterwards. I see cities, I think, as providing a high quality of life, a safe, I suppose, green environment within which people want to live, where there's jobs and there's a high, I suppose, yes, a high sort of level of standard of living. So I then sort of think, well, how does transport travel contribute to that? And I may still be in a minority of one, but I'm looking at sort of slower travel as being the one of the key elements here. So suggesting that slower travel is one way to improve quality of life and to contribute to carbon reduction. And it also potentially has safety and health benefits, particularly if people cycle and walk a lot more. Secondly, travel time savings have been one of the key determinants of thinking within transport. But increasingly, perhaps one needs to be thinking of notions of travel time reliability and reasonable travel times. So it's not necessarily a minimisation, but suggesting what would it be reasonable to do. And part of this is that we can now use time much more effectively when we're actually travelling. I've heard people on trains hoping that the train's going to be late so they can finish off something that they're actually doing whilst they're travelling. You know, so the sort of dynamic is changing, I think, probably quite substantially. And if it's not the speed argument and the travel time minimisation argument, I think that takes us more towards the quality. Smaller vehicles, as I said, cars and vans, parking open space, relocation space, using active transport modes for 50% of trips. Perhaps in cities to have, as the EU is now suggesting, to have zero low emission zones within cities. So again, other pollutants would be reduced. Promotion of active travel, 2/3 of adults do not get enough exercise, and probably academics are among those because they spend all their time travelling by air. Or am I wrong? But promoting active travel is an important part of a healthy city. Investment in clean, efficient public transport, and as I say, looking at new ownership patterns in terms of vehicles. I don't know, but that would be the way in which I would actually sort of suggest is a way forward. So we move on to transport governance. I think here again we have quite a lot of issues that, to my mind, A, are problematic and B, are quite difficult to resolve. Whether it's at the more local level or whether it's at the global level. And I just want to try and illustrate some of these. The work of Gregory Unruh, I think, is quite interesting here, because he argues that the way in which people look at these problems from a governance perspective is in a sort of three ways. Firstly, the most popular way is to look at the end-of-pipe argument. So this is looking at things like catalytic converters, looking at ways in which we can filter out some of the pollutant. So the system is left intact, but you do some work to treat the externalities. So in a sense, people can do exactly what they were doing before. It makes no difference that they're doing it in a slightly cleaner way. Secondly, he suggests that we could have continuity measures, which is saying, right, okay, we accept we've got a problem, but how can we actually continue to do much as we're doing at the present time? So we have incremental change and innovation, but we maintain, or basically maintain, the current system. So the example he uses here is we have the internal combustion engine, the conventional engine. We move to a hybrid or electric. We might move to a fuel cell. So effectively, we've got incremental change and we've got innovation, but effectively we've got the same system. We've got the same cars in the system, but we've got a different motive power. We've got a different power unit within. And thirdly, he talks about discontinuity measures, where there's radical innovation and transition to something different. And interesting to my mind is that he runs out of ideas here. So the sorts of things that are actually being suggested are transit-oriented developments or compact cities, possibly high-speed rail as being discontinuity measures. But I wouldn't say that those are really radical innovations, that those are quite easily encompassable within that. But what he does argue is that society, or through government, is quite keen on numbers 1 and 2, perhaps not so much on numbers 3 or on 4 or 5 if they existed. So his conclusion is that transport is and discourses related to transport are heavily influenced by these scientific and expert understandings, and a desire to accommodate additional demand for transport, but primarily through the sorts of measures here. And the issue of capacity is looked at in terms of what I've already said as being new capacity rather than trying to make the best use of existing capacity. And so the conclusions I would draw from this are two things, really. One is that the current system does not encourage what I would call real innovation. It's incremental innovation. It doesn't encourage open and collaborative actions, but it's much more creating an increasingly fragmented sector, which is really difficult to bring together. And this is where, again, you get locking, particularly in this case, institutional locking. The way around it is perhaps to look increasingly at participatory approaches, looking at ways in which we can involve different stakeholders, not just people, interest groups, but also businesses, industry, government, planners. Everybody should be involved in that, in a much more communicative planning approach that has less emphasis on technocratic process. So what one's trying to do here is both to give greater clarity in terms of powers, responsibilities, but also to get people involved in the process so they understand the rationale, the reasoning behind what you're trying to do. And secondly, that the increase in specialisation and compartmentalisation needs to be broken down. So this makes it really difficult to coordinate and allow holistic approaches. So where one needs to be looking at, and perhaps quite radically, some people are now suggesting that transport shouldn't be looked at as a separate part of anything. It should be looked at as an integrated part of everything. So it shouldn't be a separate transport ministry. There should be transport in the health ministry, in the education ministry, in the housing ministry, in all of the ministries in a much more of a cross-cutting way. The same in terms of trying to look at the services between the different forms of transport. So we've got a fragmented, in many different ways, system at the moment, and it's looking at ways in which greater coherence, cohesion can be given to that. And this again looks back at the sort of multi-level perspectives, the work of Frank Yields and others, René Kemp, looking at ways in which these niches, regimes and landscapes actually operate, not just at a functional level, but at an institutional, organisational level as well. So it's looking at how those decisions are actually made. And looking at these pathways, the timing of those pathways, and the way in which one can get innovation in a variety of ways working much more better, much more effectively within its regime and the landscape. So it's, I think, beginning to sort of suggest that there has to be a different way in which this actually works, not just at the local level, but also at the global level. And this again is an incredibly frustrating sort of area to deal with, about responsibilities in terms, again, if we're talking about carbon or energy or about pollution and things, who is responsible, who ought to be paying for it, what are legacies and everything else between different countries. The contestability of the whole science of it, which I think, as I said, is diminishing, but the complexity is still there, the need to embrace both aviation and maritime within that. But one thing I think which is underlying this is that much of the cleaner air and the less carbon and less pollution in the richer countries has been exported elsewhere. So the emissions have gone to the countries that are now manufacturing, that are producing the goods that we're actually consuming. So the second part of the debate is to move away from the consumption side, but also to look at a way in which you can account for pollution, not from where it's actually produced, but it should be related to where it's actually consumed. So the accounting should be allocated to the end users rather than to the other users. But also, if one looks at the sort of the arithmetic, and these are very sort of ballpark figures, and don't take them down because they have no validity to them at all, in the sense that they're based on a series of quite strong assumptions, but I just wanted to sort of give an indication of this, again, the scale of the problem that is actually confronting us within transport. In this column, there are figures for 2008, and as I said, it's about 7 now, but 6.6 gigatons of CO2. These are really difficult to get any estimates of in any sort of meaningful way, but this was done with some work with the Netherlands Economic Institute. These are the numbers that we came up with. So the global total is about 30 gigatons of CO2, which land transport contributes that, air transport that, and shipping that level. If, as the sort of the best science suggests, that we should be halving that level of emissions by 2050, what does this mean for transport? And I think it's a pretty sort of bleak figure, because yes, probably in land transport there are potentially really good opportunities to make reductions. You could perhaps even halve it, which is that big. But the possibilities here are much less clear, apparent. And if we're still going to be dependent upon long supply chains, huge amounts of freight trade moving around the world, that the global aviation business is going to expand, we then get to a situation where possibly, say 2020, 60% of all emissions in 2050 will come from the transport sector. Now, to my mind, if, as I said, there's a lot of assumptions embedded within that, but it begins to give a sort of picture of the scale, the nature and scale of change that is really confronting us. And I can't see, and this is, I think, the era I can't see a way forward in terms of global governance that is actually going to deliver anything that's going to get us anywhere near where we should be in 2050. At the national and the local level, the city level, I can see lots of good things, but I can't at the moment see anything that will actually happen. So, as I said to begin with, I'm an optimist, so I don't want to leave you with a totally sort of pessimistic view of the world and doom and gloom. But to sort of just trying to highlight a few things on an agenda in terms of the future of sustainable mobility. It has to include international travel, as I said, so it has to include both movement of people and goods. It needs to move beyond technological optimism and investment in infrastructure as path dependency to demand capacity management. So we should be looking at demand management, but also looking at ways in which we can make much better use of the existing capacity that's already there. And there should be realistic pricing of CO2, although it's not an area that I've delved in, but you're saying a price, but again, I think that has difficulties in terms. Pricing should be used to give strong indications, but there should be other measures that should complement those so that there are other possibilities. So, but a key objective really needs to be, how do we look at the issue about the length of global supply chains? Are they too long? Can they be, or should they be reduced? So we increase local production and notions of collaborative consumption. Can we substantially reduce travel distances, both for people and for freight? And in a climate-sensitive world, this is probably a good strategy to sort of develop anyway, because of the potential for disruption in long supply chains that might exist. And this is where I think the social sciences should actually be engaging with the debate, is looking at promotion of green values and changing social norms to reduce levels of consumption, to address issues of transition and implementation in governance, so that outcomes more closely reflect intentions. And this is involvement, participation, responsibility, ownership of different types of futures. To re-examine the concept of travel time, not just as a wasted time and the need to move faster to save time, but to look at it in more creative ways, that time has a whole sense of different meanings to different groups of people in different contexts. Rebalancing the dominance of the economic factors with other environmental, social factors, and really to look at the possibility of rethinking the role of the car in the city. And I started off in this series of 3 lectures with the sustainable mobility paradigm, which I come back to as this last slide. And the point I think which needs to be made is that I would suggest that probably 80–90% of the thinking, the effort, has been pushed in this element. So it's principally on efficiency, looking at, to some extent, load factors, not so much, but certainly fuels efficiency in design. A little bit, quite a lot has been done in terms of looking at the mode issue, looking at public transport, walk and cycle. So the reality has been to increase transport to promote economic growth, is common in the political sort of discourse, possibly at a lower environmental cost, and promoting some modal shift and looking at technological innovation. But what this has probably led to is increasing transport volumes and distances and more CO2, perhaps at a lower unit level, but more CO2. Where we've had much less progress has been in looking at the ways in which we can substitute or not make trips, and where we have looked at the role that organisation of city structures to be planning might take place to shorten trip lengths and things. So we need then to concentrate on these 2 elements at the front end. These have been not totally ignored, but have not had so much thinking done about it. Why do people want to take trips? Why do people want to move? What is the intense rationale behind that? But I think the final message is the one at the bottom here, is that if we are to make progress in terms of sustainable mobility, that we need strong action in all of these 4 areas, and not just in the technologies and to some extent in the modal shift, but in all 4. Thanks very much.